Next, we are delighted to welcome Fisayo Soyombo, an award-winning freelance investigative journalist and founder and editor of the Foundation for Investigative Journalism. Fisayo is better known for his undercover stories with which he exposes corruption and injustice. He will share his experience and tell us why freelancers are key for healthy democracies and the public debate. Welcome, Fisayo.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. So I'll just share my screen on my PC and I'll talk on my audio. Thanks very much. It's an honor to be here. I'll do everything I can to stick to the time, which is supposed to be 20 minutes, to talk about freelance journalism, the importance of freelance journalists, and how their work is important for societies. There's so many problems that freelance journalists face. A lot of times they have big story ideas and then they're thinking about funding, and it's such a huge problem all over the world. But then on the flip side, there are two big benefits. One is that you have the freedom of story choice. Freelance journalists can sit down and say, this is the next story I want to do. I'm going to take 5 months to prepare for it, and the 6th month I'm going to go to the field. They have the benefit of the time, and then they choose, unlike when you are in newsrooms where a lot of factors influence stories that freelance journalists do. I'm going to just run through some of the things I've done in the last 2 years by virtue of being a freelance journalist. This is a 2018 story about corruption on Nigerian highways. What I did was drive the equivalent of a stolen vehicle. I drove it from Lagos to Lagos is Nigeria's commercial hub. I drove it to Abuja, Nigeria's federal capital. A journey of more than 2,600 kilometers. I passed through 86 checkpoints, and I drove the car from Abuja to Lagos and from Lagos back to Abuja. I wasn't found out by any security agents. There were policemen on the highway. There were officials of the Nigerian Customs Service. There were officials of NDLEA, Nigeria Drug Law Enforcement Agencies. There were soldiers, the army, and it was an experience that showed me how cars get missing in Nigeria and they never get found, because once they're on the highway, you pay a small bribe. Nobody checks your papers. Nobody checks if it's your car or not. Nobody checks your identity. You are given a free pass. The biggest of all is one I did in October 2019. As a matter of fact, this was a story idea I got back in 2017. I'd wanted to do this story for 3 years, but because I was a full-time employee, opportunity wasn't there. I wasn't able to make out the time. Again, like I said, one of the benefits of freelance journalism is that time that it gives you. In 3 years as a fully employed employee, I couldn't make out the time required to go to the field. So I left a job in June, and then in July, I went to prison. What I did, I sat down with my cousin and planned as if I bought a car worth 2.8 million naira in Nigerian naira. I paid 500 and didn't pay 2.3 million, and started evading the seller of the car. And then, because I had heard that a lot of corruption and injustice were going in prison, my target, as a matter of fact, was the prison. The law in Nigeria says that if you pick up a suspect as a police station, if a court is within 40-kilometer radius of that police station, you arraign the person in court within 24 hours. If a court is more than 40 kilometers away, you arraign the person within 48 hours. If you are going to hold any suspect for more than 48 hours, you need a court order, But then, we planned, the police arrested me, thinking they were arresting the criminal, detained me. Instead of the maximum of 2 days, the police detained me for 5 days. So I was in the police cell for 5 days. I saw minors come into the cell and leave. I saw the conditions. From there, I was arraigned in court. in court officials were asking me to pay bribes. Prison officials in court, excuse me, were telling me that if I could pay them a bribe, when the court had ordered me to be remanded in prison, they told me that if I paid that bribe, I would sleep in my house that night. I would not get to prison. To show you how the criminal justice system is circumvented in Nigeria if you have money. But then, because my intention was to get to prison, I ended up not paying the bribe. They were telling me that if I had money, they would put me in special cells in prison. I wouldn't suffer. So effectively, people get sentenced to jail, but then they live almost a full life. Those were the things I found out because I had the time. From court, I was in prison. I was in prison for 8 days. So 2 weeks undercover, 5 in police cell, 8 days in prison. In prison, I found out that your records can be erased if you pay a bribe. You can have access to drugs. You can have access to sex. You live apart from the everyday freedom that you lose. It's like life is the same for you, and it's also heartbreaking. But if I wasn't a freelance journalist, I doubt that any newspaper would have given me all that time to go. I spent 2 weeks on the field. When I got back, I had to see my physiotherapist. I had to see my doctor. I needed time to get over the trauma before I started putting pen to paper. It was already 2 months. And then I did writing for less than, so it was a story that got minimum of 3 months. And I had nothing else to attend to in that time. Again, another slide showing the prison angle of the story. There's drug abuse, there's sodomy, there's bribery, there's pimping. Once you have your money in a typical Nigerian prison, once you have your money, you are fine. So it looks to the complainant that justice has been served, but a lot of times, excuse me, the guilty party is practically just having fun in prison if that person has money. A slide showing how I shared my experiences, living with a cellmate that appeared to have run mad, how prison warders set me up, how after my release from prison, I was abducted by the police again. A lot of things going on in Nigerian prisons that I found out. Few months after, I went into a psychiatric hospital. I spent 10 days undercover, pretending to be a psychiatric patient. Someone is going to ask, how was that possible? That we were not found out. I went in like a drug abuse, like how do they say, people living with substance abuse. That's the cover under which I went, spoke with had a series of sessions with a psychiatric doctor who assured me that if I answered, he told me all the questions that would be asked, and he told me how the conclusions the doctors would reach and how to answer all the questions in such a manner that they would feel I needed admission, but I did not need drugs and I did not need injections. I only needed psychotherapy. So I was right there for 10 days, and I experienced firsthand how a system that is supposed to take care of psychiatric patients is actually the ones frustrating them. Bed space is the corruption that goes into it. It's so hard to get bed space. When you do, the food in that place is terrible. And the annoying thing is that you take drugs from the mouth of patients and you give them food, but you give them food that people with irreversible mental disorder, the kind of food that they eat when left alone on the streets, that's the kind of food you give them, and you want them to recover, and that shouldn't be happening. Especially the hospital that is one of the most historic for psychiatric treatment in Nigeria. In those 10 days, I found out about staff shortage. I found out about ghost workers, people who just earn a salary for doing nothing, and the powers behind the corruption at the psychiatric hospital. As freelance journalists, one important advantage we have is that we are available for service to our country at short notice. In a full-time newsroom, a lot of factors come into play in deciding who does what story, who is available for what. But as a freelance journalist, something massive is happening, you can make yourself available for use by your country. This is a story about the end SARS protests. I'm sure a lot of listeners at one point or the other heard about the end SARS protests in Nigeria last year. You know, Nigerians trooping to the streets to protest against police brutality. And it was a very organic protest. You couldn't say this was the leader. The government were shaking to their foundations. They could not find that one person to pin down and tell to go and call the protesters to order. It happened organically. It spread from state to state without necessarily one person being the one to do all the coordination. But guess what happened? On October 20, 2020, Nigerian soldiers went to the Lekki Plaza, the venue of the biggest gathering of protesters, and shot at them, killed some of them, injured some of them, and covered it up. And so it was a big deal in Nigeria. Did this massacre happen or not? Started working on the story in late October. It happened October 20, started working about a week or 8-9 days after. And up till the end of December, I couldn't say if there was a massacre or not. I started seeing traces of a massacre in January. A 3-part series. This first part highlighting the efforts that state agents made to clean up that massacre, to give people the impression that nobody died, And then another part in the series showing the names, the photos, the videos of protesters. So there are protesters whose names I had. There were some whose names I didn't have, but whose photos I had. There were some whose photos and names I didn't have, but whose videos I had. So it's like the closest attempt to naming the victims of that massacre. And this is the last part. By the way, there were also some who were missing. I think I featured 2 people who were last seen at the toll gate, but haven't been seen since then, because all first-hand eyewitnesses I spoke with told me the soldiers came in vans and moved bodies away. And then we thought if they indeed moved bodies away, we should be able to find people who were last seen at the toll gate but haven't been found since then. And I can tell you that I got to, just last night, I met a source who got 6. The government put in so much into covering it up, but bit by bit, the information, is getting out. Last part, focusing on survivors of the massacre, people who were shot and are alive to tell the story of how the Nigerian government, in a democracy, ordered men of the Nigerian army to go to the venue of a protest ground, to go to the venue of a protest and shoot at protesters and kill a number of them. You find insurgency in Nigeria's northeast. You find right now banditry is on the rise, especially in northern Nigeria. In other parts of Nigeria, in the southwest, and of course in the north, you have herdsmen terrorizing people, and the government has not been able to overpower them with the army. But when it comes to protest, it's easy for them to do, but without the opportunity of freelance journalism, government may actually have gotten away. So just my experience of how, as a freelance reporter, I use my work to hold the government to account, to expose corruption, to expose injustice, and some cases of power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fisayo. We have a few questions in the live chat. So, Ankita Anat asked, considering the risk involved in such work, was wondering what Fisayo feels about collaborations, and asked, it is easier to take risks when working alone or easier to counter threats when working together?
I'll say that you need both. When you're working alone, it means that the risk of being given out by a third party is minimal. When you're alone and nobody knows your location, nobody can divulge it to anyone. But there are certain stories that can't be done alone. Otherwise, the fact that you are alone then gives you out. So you are going to prison. Nobody is coming to prison to check on you. You're going to the police undercover. They know that you didn't drop from heaven. You have friends and family. If nobody, no single person turns up at the police station, they start suspecting you. Can you have a suspect who doesn't have one single friend, one single family? So for the success of some investigations, you need people, you need a team. Without that team, you may not, your security may not be compromised, but then suspicion can happen on the field. But when you're working alone, the chance is absolutely remote that someone can give you out. That's the difference. So you need both.
We have time for another question, Fisayo, and it's Sedal Tobiri asks, what about how can we manage the risks?
The risk of undercover reporting, freelance investigative reporting. First of all, you need to have a plan. You need to have a plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. A lot of, for the stories that I've done, people have said, oh, this guy is a daredevil journalist. This guy doesn't run from risk. This guy, but that's not what happened. While other people saw risks and ran away at the first time of asking, what I did was to stay back and analyze. Can risk A, what are the risks? List all of them one by one. Which one can be surmounted? So when you analyze, you know what can be surmounted. You move to the next stage and you say, if something goes wrong, what is the plan A? If this goes wrong, what is plan B? You know, it's about turning the story in your head a lot of times. If I'm at the police station and a policeman finds me out, what do I do? If my phone gives me out, what do I do? If someone visits me and the person gives me out, what do I do? You know, replaying many scenarios in your head, you know, way before you go to the field, which is why I always recommend that no story should be done in a hurry. Have it in your head for months. So you turn it over and over and you replay all the possible scenarios and you have your answers for them.
Thank you, Fisayo. That's a really good advice. And thank you for being here, for joining us today, sharing with us your experience and your knowledge. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Anna.
Thank you very much, Fisayo, for this moment and for sharing your amazing experience with us, because we know that in the community there are a lot of investigative freelance journalists facing the same challenges and risks as you are doing. So thank you very much.
Labdien, buenos dias, bos dias.
Hi, hello.
This is the European Journalism Center.
Since 1992,
we've been helping journalists all over Europe.
Now we ask for your support.
Join the European Journalism Collective.
And with a small donation, you can help us remain independent and sustainable.
So we can continue supporting journalists just like you.
And do even more.
And do even more. And do even more.